Hello and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, a podcast about all things fandom told through objects, stories, and studies with a bit of silliness along the way. Your hosts on this journey are pop culture writer, journalist, and cosplay expert Holly Swinyard, and myself, Vivian Asimos, a public anthropologist and pop culture academic with a PhD in religion and popular culture. Join us as we wander down the incredible and intriguing path into fan culture, its history, the people who make it up, and the way that we look at this ever-growing part of our society. Fair warning, we may talk about some adult themes, use some adult language, and possibly get a little bit nerdy about the whole thing. You have been warned.
Hello and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, and if this sounds weird, there's a reason. Woo! My name is Holly Swinyard, and I am a pop culture writer and author. And the person giggling at me, like, hysterically.
I'm Vivian Asimos, and I'm a pop anthropologist. And I'm looking at Holly wearing, I guess, half fangs now that one of them has fallen out.
And the reason I have no fangs in now, so I can actually talk, is because today's object is a set of vampire fangs, because we're going to talk about Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire and everything that goes with it. Vivian, what do you know about Interview with a Vampire?
So, I was trying to think of this morning, and I haven't personally read it or any in the series. But I think one of my sisters has. I'm pretty sure. Unless I'm mistaking it with another vampire sexy series.
There's a lot of them.
Because there are a lot of them, but I'm pretty sure it was Anne Rice. I'm like 90% sure. So I saw it being consumed near me, but that's the extent of my experience. I also haven't seen the movie or anything.
Really?
So I know the gist, because like we were saying, it's kind of similar to a lot of things. Anne Rice really did have, I recognize, had a huge impact also on urban fantasy and the way her stories are being sculpted. A
lot of the reason why vampire romance or vampire novels or whatever are kind of in the modern era are the way they are is probably because of Anne Rice. I think she had quite a substantial impact on how we see vampires in, because you can kind of see it in like the Underworld series and even Twilight and stuff, like the same kind of that idea of the very sensual, sexy vampire. I mean, obviously that's vampire lore, right?
Yeah, I was about to say, I mean, there's hints of it also in like Bram Stoker, but I think Anne Rice was kind of responsible for kicking it up quite a big notch.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, I think making the untouchable but deeply kind of erotic side of it is in the 90s and everything was definitely it's very 90s, isn't it? Like, if anybody has ever seen the film or read the books, it's got a very specific tone. But there's also been the new series which came out beginning of this year, which has been very well received and I really enjoyed. So it was I'm going to say HBO. Possibly. I can't remember. There's too many streaming services nowadays. I don't know. They changed a bit of the story. They set it in the 1920s rather than 1800s France, I think the original set. Terrible of me not to remember that. But they kind of shifted it all. They changed the dynamics a little bit, which I really liked. I thought it was a very good modern take on the story. And really queer. Like, really... They really went there, which the films and the books kind of don't. In the TV show, they went, yeah, so these two, they're definitely a couple. Yeah, cool. Which I thought was very good. It was like, okay, cool, we can do that now. Excellent. I mean, I read the first book, and I think I was too young for them. I was 12 or 13. And so I didn't actually read the rest until I kind of engaged with the film and the TV show and stuff. And I have a lot of friends who it's their favourite thing, I'm shocked that gothy cosplayers are really into Interview with Vampire. Let's be honest, you're kind of an Interview with Vampire person or you're a Matrix person, and I kind of feel like the twain shall never meet. I don't know why, it's this weird thing. It's like one or the other. And I don't know how that's happened. But yeah, so the reason I really wanted to talk about it though isn't specifically the books and stuff, though they're very good and very interesting, and there's a lot of stuff going on with those, or the film, or the TV show, or any of the actual media that is Interview with the Vampire. It's actually to do with the fandom and the way that Anne Rice herself dealt with her fandom, because I think it's gone down in like historical infamy within fan communities that has, even if people don't realize it, has like rolling effects to this day with the way that fanfic particularly and fandom deal with fan fiction. And that's something that I see people coming up through fandom who have kind of forgotten or never knew about this, and they're like, why do people say I do not own these characters on their fan fictions? Like, isn't that obvious? And it's like, oh, my sweet summer child, you know. So I think we're going to take a little bit of a journey into some fandom history and talk about that, and some stuff that allegedly happened that nobody has ever come forward and brought categorical proof of forward. So we're talking a lot of sort of, I don't want to say hearsay because that's not necessarily true, but It's a lot of alleged and urban myth within fan communities and stuff like that, which there are little things that kind of make you go about. So it's quite an interesting story, and I'm excited to tell it. So this all happens in like 2000, the millennium, 2001, when I was a young baby child of seven-ish, I don't know, 7 or 8, which means you must have also been that old, and therefore we had no idea what was going on the internet, thank goodness. Terrifies me that there are children that young on like TikTok and things. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah, exactly. But we were living in ignorance, whereas going on places like Usenet, if people know what Usenet is, the sort of pre-internet forums and all that kind of stuff, because the old people did have the...
Will people even remember, or I guess the younger generation, will they know about like AOL chat rooms?
Oh, no, I don't know. Do I have to explain what AOL chat rooms are in this episode?
We might have to. We'll do it really fast because I'm sure our audience is probably not that young, let's be honest, but
that's true. So
just in case.
So pre the internet, when there wasn't the internet, some really smart people at some universities and things like that came up with an idea of connecting everyone through computer systems. That was through sort of, it wasn't the World Wide Web, it wasn't that open, it was sort of like you had to sign in and know how to get there, and what you ended up with was little chat rooms where people would discuss predominantly nerdy shit and science and all that kind of stuff, but also the other type of nerdy shit, which is fandom culture, because of course those two things will be forever intertwined. And this was called, initially, I think Usenet must have been one of the earliest ones.
I think so.
There's Mud as well, and then AOL. And AOL is probably the one that most people who are our sort of age and maybe a bit older probably know about, because that was sort of the influx of people who weren't strictly academics or tech geeks kind of into the online sphere. And AOL chat rooms were, I want to say, closed spaces. They weren't like Discord. You didn't have to know like a password or something to get in, but some of them needed. But you kind of had to search for them through newsletters or links through from other places and all that kind of stuff to get to them, or set your own up, and they were essentially
Google didn't exist yet.
Yeah, no, there was no search engines. You had to kind of jump from site to site, or somebody had to tell you about something. It was all very like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, do you want to come and hang out in my forum? Which still definitely happens. But It was a bit kind of, I would describe them a bit more like, I don't want to say, they're not like Reddit, because Reddit's a bit more of a free-for-all. They were more organised than that. I don't know if... They are like Discord, right? Like Discord, I would say, with the boards is the most similar.
Discord's probably the closest similarity that we have. But it's if Discord wasn't always needing a password or an invite link to join.
Exactly. Yeah. And people would go in there, and also a bit more kind of, unlike Discord, people would, even if you were in a main forum, you would probably have your forum boards that you hung out on. You didn't necessarily bother looking on the others, because they weren't the ones, it was like a whole fandom space, but they were predominantly, you'd be like, oh, my friends hang out in this board, so I'm going to go in that one. Or at least that was my experience of it, very end of the sort of the journey with LiveJournal and things like that. Because I'm not old enough to have actually been on AOL forums, but I have older friends who have described them to me. And they were pretty cool places. And one of the things that I think people don't necessarily realise is actually how many creators used to go in and like see what the fans were talking about, like with little secret hidden accounts and things like that, which I don't know if that's cute or fun or a little creepy, but it could be either. And so a lot of people, this would be where they would share their fan fictions. This is people sharing theories, talking about stuff, all that kind of thing that you see now on Tumblr and TikTok and Discord, a bit on Twitter, but less so. This is where that was happening, right? It was all, and each fandom kind of was locked into its own board. You didn't necessarily cross the streams. No, of course some people did, but you would go to the Interview of a Vampire board, or you would go to the Star Trek board, or you would go to the Star Trek Next Generation very specific thing board,
Yeah.
because Star Trek's huge. And there'd even be like specific forums just for shipping certain characters and stuff like that. Like there definitely were very niche boards, because of course there were. But yeah, so that's how AOL and Usenet worked, and you also had newsletters through this, so like email style newsletters. So that's early internet fandom in a nutshell-ish. I'm sure somebody's done a much better breakdown of it, and maybe we'll do one at some point, because it is interesting, but it's very technical, I think. But yeah, so this is all happening in the late 90s, all the way through the 90s and into the 2000s. And particularly in the 2000s, people are on LiveJournal, and LiveJournal is still going, but I think I think now it doesn't really, I think it's there, but people don't really use it because stuff happened that, again, we're not getting into here because it's way too complicated. And I don't want to go down that path either. But let's just say it sort of died a bit of a death, but it's sort of just carrying on. Basically, I think authors, particularly creators of shows and stuff, like I said, they were coming into these boards, they were aware of their fans, and they were more able to access them. And so a lot of people had a lot more, it's relatively well known that like Terry Pratchett used to have dummy accounts that he would go in and ask questions about things, or like get people's opinions about stuff in regards to like research he was doing, or to like he'd just kind of listen to what fans were saying about stuff so that he could get feedback without it being like a review.
Yeah.
Or people being like, oh my god, it's Terry Pratchett. And the same is true, like the X-Men writers used to go into the forums and things and just hang out and stuff like that. So lots of people were doing this in order to engage more with their fan base. But the reason we're going to talk about Anne Rice is because she really didn't like it. And for whatever reason, she basically destroyed her own fandom through actions that have allegedly happened through her and her lawyers. So we've used the word lawyers, which I think means that we're going into interesting territory. Because in around 2000, the Interview of a Vampire fandom sort of just vanished. It just disappeared. It basically stopped existing online, unless you knew exactly how to find it with certain literal passwords, literally being invited into spaces, all this sort of stuff. It just stopped existing. And that was due to the fact that, allegedly, Anne Rice and her legal team had started contacting fanfic writers, board admins, fandom organisers, all these sorts of people with cease and desist orders and threatening them with legal action over fanfiction being posted and fanfiction being written, including revealing that they knew people's work and home addresses. Or at least this is what the people who were contacted were saying was happening to them. And they were basically being threatened with, we are going to take you to court if you don't stop writing fanfiction and take it down immediately. And the Usenet board, which was called Black Rose, the Black Rose, basically vanished as if it had never existed. And it was just, that sort of thing just hadn't happened before. How does that happen? Like the fandom that up until now just existed and was fine and just going along suddenly just is gone, So basically in 2000, in April, and we were talking about this beforehand, I have double checked. This statement still exists on Anne Rice's website. It's still there. You can go and look at it now. And it says, I do not allow fanfiction. The characters are copyrighted. It upsets me terribly to even think about fanfiction with my characters. I advise my readers to write your own original stories with your own characters. It is absolutely essential that you respect my wishes. I have never, ever seen any kind of creator make this sort of statement about fan works, ever. Like, I know that some people just don't like it and don't engage with it, but I've never seen anybody make a statement basically being like, stop doing this to people who are fans of yours, you know? Then I think it was about a few days later. Oh, yeah. So the end of that month, in the beginning of May, the archive that had been holding all of the fan fiction and stuff on this forum, this Usenet forum, suddenly doesn't exist anymore. And there is a note in its place just on the screen that reads, this page no longer exists in the public forum. Note, there is nothing here. No specs, which is what they called fan fictions. No stories, no nothing. Now maybe, hypothetically, if you had the password and the handshake, you could get into a private forum where private citizens could share private words with each other without being told by authors with too much money to waste that their First Amendment is taken away and freedom of speech no longer exists. But that is just hypothetical. So, you know, it's a bit catty, I agree. Yeah. I think it's a bit like, oh, yeah, it's very clearly people who are pissed off replying to somebody who's pissed them off. The fact that a fandom was driven underground by the people they were a fan of, I think is astounding. Like, the thing that happened out of this was basically you can't find Interview with Vampire fanfiction from this time at all. It's all gone. It's all disappeared deep into these forums and archives and all this sort of stuff. Some, I think, is starting to appear back up on things like Archive of Our Own now that, unfortunately, and it is a big shame that Anne Rice passed away last year. It's a massive shame. She was an incredible writer. So, you know, that's very sad. But obviously for the fans, it has meant a certain amount of freedom that they don't feel like they're being watched over all the time and not being allowed to do things. I don't know how the estate are going to go forward with it. But the following year, so in 2001, Anne Rice's lawyers sent a letter to fanfiction.net, specifically the website, demanding that all works based on Anne Rice's properties be removed from the site, and they were. It was just gone. So obviously people took these letters seriously. They took these things seriously. That is one of the things that we do know, that those fan fictions all vanished, and there was an announcement made that it was going to happen, so people could grab them before they, you know, if they didn't have them saved on hard drives and things like that. So yeah, within a year, essentially, this entire fandom, its forums, its chat rooms, its fanfic on other sites, on other archives, was pretty much gone. And they started using codes and hidden phrases and all this sort of stuff to kind of talk about it. And it's one of those things that I think a lot of people just don't know happened. And it's definitely the reason why other fandoms started writing things like, I do not own these characters, this is a fan work, all this kind of stuff that you might not see so much anymore, but you definitely used to see for a long time during the 2000s and 2010s on fan fictions, to be like, these are copyrighted characters, I don't own them. You know, either in the tags or in the notes at the beginning of the fic, or there'd be a little thing at the end. You know, people would put that on there because they were afraid that this would happen to them. And I think it's a massive, massive shame that this happened because of one writer, you know?
I have a legal question that I recognize you might not know the answer to, because as we said at the beginning of this, we are writers, we are not lawyers. But because I do video essays over on Incidental Mythology on YouTube, go check it out, but I therefore have to deal with a lot of copyright issues. Because when you're talking about a movie, you use clips from the movie, and then the people who make the movie are like, I found clips! And you're like, yeah, but it's not what you think it is. But basically, I have therefore known quite extensively where my fair use lies. so I can defend my use of it. How does fan fiction work? Because I know that that's quite... Obviously, it's very different than commentary for educational purposes, which is what I do.
Yeah.
But is there something within fair use that fan fiction could fall under?
Fan fiction, as long as you are not selling it, as long as you are not making money off it, and I think even as long as you aren't making like a living off of it, it's a muddy area. I'm not a lawyer. Is fair use. And people who were involved in this particular thing at the time said that if they had had the money and they weren't like so shocked and afraid, they really would have fought the claim, because actually they don't think that, again, this is all things that people were saying in the forums and the boards and all this other stuff. So how much of it is real, true, what happened, all this sort of stuff, we don't have the actual documents and things. So we're taking everything with a pinch of salt. But obviously something did happen. But people have said since the time that actually they would have taken her to court, but they would have been like, all right, do it. Right, fine. But nobody had the money. Nobody had, these are all
and
people who would,
I don't know how things work, because obviously with the internet, you're talking to people from all sorts of different places, and in the United States, even different states have different laws on the way that certain things work. But most of the time, if you say go to a lawyer, I know it's too late now, but if you go to a lawyer, if someone else is getting hit with this now, this is... Yeah. So my only sound legal advice from a non-lawyer that I will give you is you can go to a lawyer, and typically if they were to take, say, Anne Rice to court for it, if they win, then you will have Anne Rice pay for your lawyer fees. So it won't actually come out of you, and most lawyers won't sign up for that if they think they won't win. Which is a really good way to ensure that somebody who can't afford it, but that the lawyer believes actually does have a good shot and is in the right, they can actually help them out and still get paid for their work, because they're getting the rich person to pay for it.
The other thing I wonder is whether, because this was all happening in 2000,
talk to a lawyer,
2001. Yeah, talk to a lawyer, or a solicitor. Yeah, talk to somebody. But yeah, I wonder whether it was almost unheard of. Like, I wonder whether... Yeah, I mean, I could imagine it being... Yeah, that it would have been... Yeah. And that possibly, again, like in the time... I managed to just knock my desk, which is great. At the time, people were just... They just didn't know what to do. If this sort of thing, showed up at your door, at your house, in your email inbox, it's going to be really scary. And again, we don't have the documentation, so we don't know exactly what happened. We just know that stuff happened. Yeah. And I will continue to put the word allegedly in here, because
we don't want to deal with the lawyers as much as I was just saying that.
No, exactly. That while it's very clear that something did go down, we don't know exactly what it was, and we only have the words and the statements of the people who it allegedly happened to and these paper trails of the fact that fanfiction.net took down all the fics and the forums disappeared, and there are these kind of very catty, petty notes between author and fans and things like that they do exist. So something clearly happened, but exactly what and how bad it was, obviously nobody but the people it happened to knows. But I wonder how, if you just, you're just a little fan doing your thing on the internet in your little fandom board, like, yay, this is fun, and that stuff starts happening, how much you want to just hide in a corner. Yeah. You don't want to... It might be a very different world now,
Yeah, for people who are... If we do have younger listeners who are not remembering these days, it might be worth noting that nowadays when you do a lot of different things online, there is a very easy trace to figure out who it is, either through email. I know there's certain websites where you actually have to put in your address and... things like that. It makes it... You can still get around it. I'm sure people who are much more intelligent than me can figure out ways to stay anonymous online. But with a little bit of elbow grease, people can figure out who people are fairly easily. But that's not really how it was back then. Back then, it was way harder to find. It took a lot more elbow grease, and so I could imagine, that if it did show up at your door, that's not going to be as easy to trace, and therefore it would be very scary.
Yeah. And like I said, I'm working off the statements of... Allegedly. I'm working off the statements of people who claim this happened. I'm working off things that are now 23 years old.
Yeah. And
there is no paper trail for. So, like I said, we take it all with a pinch of salt and we look at it as a urban myth and a tale of fandom versus creator, you know, like what could happen.
So what I find really fascinating is the fact that they didn't disappear entirely, right?
No, not at all. And they went underground. It
shows a really weird relationship that people have with fiction, and we can kind of relate this in a very different way to J.K. Rowling. And I say that because I recognize that Anne Rice... I don't know Anne Rice. I don't know what, you know, her understanding of trans people were, so I don't want to necessarily lump her in the same exact kind of category. However, you know, this idea of combative natures between the understanding and belief of the author versus the understanding and beliefs of the fan base, and how, you know, on one hand you could easily just be like, oh, well, just don't do Harry Potter, you know, okay, well, we'll just stop caring about Interview with Vampire. Anne Rice scared the shit out of me, I don't want to partake in this anymore, and you just completely back out. But the love of the fiction is somehow stronger than the dislike or fear of the creator, that you continue to do it anyway, despite that.
Yeah, exactly. Like, these people did not stop loving these books, despite what happened. And that must be very difficult. Like, I feel that you're right, the Harry Potter fans must be having a very difficult time of it right now. Because it's hard to be a fan of something where the creator is doubling down in ways that you just don't agree with, or are scary to you, or a danger to you. You know, like particularly with J.K. Rowling, there are people who are queer and trans fans who she must feel like a danger to, or must, you know,
is definitely giving money to organizations that do want to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, again, I don't really want our podcast to get sued by anybody, so
allegedly,
you know, that's great. Allegedly. But I kind of feel like this must have been a very similar situation where you're being actively targeted, I guess, or at least feels like you're being targeted by somebody who you can't, who's a lot more powerful than you, has a lot more money than you, is literally the creator of the thing you're there to be a fan of. You know, the literal sort of godhead figure of any fandom is the creator, right? If you're into fandom in that way, that must be a really difficult thing to deal with. Like, how do you square that up within yourself? That I love this thing, but this person is hurting me, you know? It must be very hard. And like, because for me personally, I'm no longer a fan of Harry Potter. I used to be when I was a kid. I was a big fan, and it had a kind of a little bit of a small renaissance in my 20s. I can live without it, you know, personally. But for other people, that's not the case. You know, that's not the way. I've lived in Star Wars land for too long.
I feel so. I fall under this camp, and I feel very, very strongly towards death of the author, and I've heard it used towards J.K. Rowling in a way that I disagree with, which is, oh well, who cares then? I'll keep partaking and buying stuff anyway, which is not how I use it. How I use it is that the fiction stands apart in the sense that I'm not a huge Harry Potter fan, but I'm just going to keep using it as an example because I think, like you said, I think it's a really good, at least contemporary comparison for people who don't know Anne Rice and weren't around 20 years ago. But basically that when you create something and you put it out in the world, you no longer own it. And I personally believe, I think that it's good for you to own it in the sense that you get money for your services, and that's kind of your extension of it. And I think of this in most senses of anything, musicians, everything. You can then kind of, once it's out there, the way that people take it is the way that people take it. And we could probably do a whole story on the creator of Pepe the Frog. Because
I wrote about that for The Guardian.
Yeah, it's a super interesting story, but it sucks. That's kind of the bad. We keep talking about people who are taking down fan fiction or who are transphobic, which are obviously things that we strongly, disagree with that stance. But here's somebody on the other side who is, as far as I'm aware, is a nice person. and their creation ended up being used by white supremacists. And
it must suck.
It sucks. But unfortunately, if we're going to allow it one way... So I kind of see where Anne Rice is coming from in the sense of you don't know what people are using it for. And if I created something, I would be very uncomfortable if my characters were being used to substantiate white supremacy or transphobia or any other kind of hated and hatred that's going out.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if I'm going to celebrate trans people using my stories to demonstrate how proud they are of themselves and to celebrate being trans, then I unfortunately have to also be okay with the fact that it might be used in the opposite way. And I can try to make lots of stances and lots of commentary if I don't agree with this, but it is a tricky situation, isn't it?
It really is. And I kind of feel like, particularly in the situation we're talking about, I think Anne Rice, as a writer, felt a lot of ownership, rightly or wrongly so, over these characters in a way that is unusual, I would say, for even like writers and creators and things like that. There is a whole thing about her having a ongoing like tit for tat battle with a guy who bought the parking lot that Lazat was meant to die in the books in New Orleans because it's a real place, and he built like a restaurant on it, like a really, like, I think it's a diner or something, and they had this ongoing thing in like ads in the newspaper where she would write as Lazat, like, against this guy. Again, this exists, like, you know, you can see it, it's really weird. So clearly she felt a very distinct ownership of these stories in a way that a lot of people maybe don't. I don't know. I mean, other writers might. I have yet to see another writer kind of have quite so much of a "this is my thing" and people can't spoil it kind of feeling over their books. They sort of go, "I've written the thing, enjoy it, let it go."
I think Rowling's probably pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
I know that she's gotten quite upset at somebody wrote a fan fiction that was a retelling of Harry Potter as Harriet Potter, where Harry is a trans woman, which I think is amazing. And, you know, she's obviously not very happy with that one. But I don't know if it's quite to the same legal extent. But, you know, I think her constant tweets of trying to rewrite things and actually, if you look at this, I wasn't racist when really it really was. You know, all of these things that I think things like Twitter have almost made it harder, where she feels the need to keep going, where I think if Anne Rice was on Twitter, I don't know how things would have been.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I kind of feel like there is so much around this that like feels very almost like psychological, like the way that the creator is interacting with fandom and the fans interacting with the creator, that is relatively unusual and very much clearly feels to be, at least to me, about who gets to say what these characters, these people that one person has made up, can do or are allowed to do, or how they interact with each other and all that kind of stuff, and not being able to kind of necessarily let that go. Like, I know that Neil Gaiman has talked about how he really likes seeing what fans do, or he doesn't necessarily always engage with it, but he obviously interacts with his fans in what he would hope to be a positive way, and likes talking about like people's headcanons and all this sort of stuff. And then you've got people like Mark Hamill who are like, well, if you want Luke Skywalker to be gay, he's gay. You want him to be trans, he's trans. You know, he's very much said statements along those lines to be like, this character is for you, the fans. He's not for you, me. He can be what you want him to be. And so you have like the opposite end of the spectrum where people are very much like, you have ownership of them. The fandom has ownership of them because we no longer do, you know. And I think that's a very different perspective. So I think it just probably comes down to the fact of like how you perceive your own works. Like, are you putting it out there basically going, oh, I'm giving you like sort of a window into this world, and my window is the only window? Or are you being like, hey, here's this world that you can look at and you can decide what happens next, you know. So I think there is some very different ideas about how these things work. I mean, it's quite interesting because I really like the Cthulhu mythos and all that kind of stuff. I find that kind of horror really fascinating. But H.P. Lovecraft, terrible human being. Terrible. Like the worst. Like the actual worst. And I am loving the reclamation of this world, these ideas, all this sort of stuff by people and creating like Lovecraft Country, which was the amazing, just genuinely brilliant and a massive reclamation. I can't talk today. I have taken the fangs out, I promise. Of like that stuff by people of colour, and because obviously Lovecraft was
massive
the worst.
Racist.
Massive
like
racist.
Okay, for people who don't know, because I've heard somebody was like, well, the time was really racist. He was racist for the time. People in his time were like, whoa, dude.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's how racist he was. Racist people were like, calm down.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth noting that a lot of what we call the Cthulhu mythos wasn't actually written by him. He kind of came up with a lot of the ideas, and then other writers who worked on weird fiction magazines at the time took the ideas and ran with them. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about, particularly some of the major characters like Hasta and all this sort of stuff, were more and the Yellow King, they were kind of created by other people and worked with other people and that stuff. It's very interconnected. Actually, if you want to do a deep dive into Cthulhu mythos, you can link all the way from like the original like Cthulhu stuff all the way to the Tarzan books with like characters being mentioned in all of them, which means that Tarzan exists in the Cthulhu universe. There you go. I think that's really funny. And they're all kind of working off people like H.G. Wells anyway. So a lot of this stuff it's all very mishy-mashy, and I kind of think that particularly in regards to H.P. Lovecraft, who doesn't really have an estate because he died penniless and alone with no children. So,
yay.
Good. So, like, anything to do with him doesn't necessarily... Like, there's no money being made off it. Like, other people have taken it and reworked it and changed it and pulled what they want from different places and all this kind of stuff, and are very actively reclaiming parts of the narrative that were used against them. I think that is death of the author, right? That is this, like, if you look at H.P. Lovecraft, you're like, this is death of the author in the most broadest and literal way. If no matter how you look at it, it is.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say, because I saw somebody using it as like the sense of like, oh, death of the author, so it doesn't matter if I keep giving J.K. Rowling money, and it's like that's not really what that means. No. And I think that the people who are still partaking in Harry Potter fandom without partaking in the J.K. Rowling financial side of it, and who are reading into it the stories that they find in it that are trans substantiating, because I have a friend who's huge into Harry Potter and has made like huge arguments to me, and I don't even care, and so you can imagine with people who do, but huge arguments to me about this one character being a trans character, and this huge great example of trans characters that they grew up with. So, for that person to read this and still see it that way, and just to say, well, screw her, and I'm not going to partake in that, I'm not going to give her money, but I'm still going to love what I saw in this fiction. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean by death of the author. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that's the case. Like I said, I adore the sort of the Cthulhu mythos. I'm not even going to call it the Lovecraft mythos, because that's not what it is. It's its own, very much its own beast, who is dead but sleeping. Yeah, okay. I've read a lot. It's one of my favorite things, and I have had to do a lot of kind of thinking about how I want to approach it, how I would like to be part of that sort of fanscape and all this sort of stuff, and it's kind of ended up with, I kind of really like it, but I think I'm just going to do it on my own.
Yeah.
Because, this is fun. And I can engage with the newer works that are being made by other people. Like I said, Lovecraft Country, amazing, genuinely brilliant, and there have been games coming out recently. And it's quite nice to see when things go out of copyright, the weird stuff that happens. Like, there is currently out now a Sherlock Holmes Cthulhu crossover game, and I am so buzzed to play it. It looks amazing. Honestly amazing. And one of my friends did some of the voices for it, and I'm very proud of him.
Oh.
So it's like, yay! But, like, that kind of stuff, that's what I would call... Like, you're right, that is what I would call death of the author. And when you've taken it and you've made it your own thing, it's not just, oh, but I don't like J.K. Rowling, but I'm still gonna do the thing. And I think in the case of the Vampire Chronicles fandom, they went and they hid themselves, and they very much became their own little community that wasn't about Anne Rice. It wasn't about her as an author. It was about what they saw these characters being, and they are now able to kind of be like, hey, we still exist. We're still here. You know, they survived it to a greater or lesser extent. Whereas I think other people, you know, if you did that nowadays, like if this happened nowadays, it would be harder to do so because you couldn't, I don't know, you'd probably go into Discord, but you'd lose people along the way because people wouldn't be able to get into the Discord, you know, stuff like that. So it's
Which I'm sure they did lose people, but it is
yeah.
really amazing that they were able to go underground effectively, which I think is also partly due to the time, but partly also due to their own ingenuity and thoughtfulness. And also to say, in a huge sense, you know, allegedly, screw you, and I'm going to, and we're going to do what we want and love these characters the way we want, and we don't need you to be a part of it, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, I think so, and I do kind of feel for Anne Rice as a writer and somebody who is currently writing their first like fiction stuff. You do feel very attached to these characters, and you do kind of want to be like, I don't want anyone to. It's not touch them. It's kind of like, oh, I'm worried about what people might do with them. But at the same time, you kind of have to accept that once, you know, hopefully my fiction work will get out there and I won't just be a non-fiction writer forever. Although I like writing non-fiction, but it would be nice to do something else. I'm tired of it, Grandma. You know, you have to just kind of go, well, if people like this, then they're going to have their own ideas and they won't necessarily match up with my ideas. And that's cool. That's really cool that I'll be able to go, here's some characters, and they'll go, oh, I see this thing in them, and like, I didn't see that thing in them, and I wrote them. That's awesome, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I think, like you were saying about your friend too, I'm assuming the character they're talking about is Remus Lupin. That kind of feels like the one.
No, they were talking about Tonks.
Oh, that's also interesting.
Because Tonks is able to change themselves.
Change themselves, yeah.
And so they were saying, why not gender? Which I thought was really
fair
cool.
enough.
So I think it was more of like a gender fluid more than like full trans, but not that they're not full trans. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Binary trans.
Yes.
Yeah. That's interesting. But yeah, so they've read something into that character that clearly J.K. Rowling never intended to write into it.
Yeah.
You know, into them. Tonks. Whatever. And that, I think, is quite an interesting thing when, in many ways, J.K. Rowling had written other things into these characters that now people are like, actually, that thing you wrote in, we don't really agree with, you know?
Yeah.
So it's quite a interesting way to see the work. Like, I always think that things like the Terry Pratchett books are really interesting. I will go back to Terry Pratchett 100 times because you've got the dwarves, and they're a race within the Discworld who all dwarves are male, right? That's by the rules of dwarfness, they're all male, except clearly they're not, right? You have to they make more dwarfs, but by social standards, everyone uses he him. Until one dwarf goes, but I don't want to use he him. I want to use she her, and decides that she's a woman. And we don't know biologically what Cheery is. We're never told, right? Ever. Just that Cheery is a girl and she's a woman, and that's how she identifies and that's what she is. That is a trans storyline, but Terry Pratchett wrote it back in the 80s, intending it to be a feminist storyline about like reclaiming your femininity and all this sort of stuff, right? Or at least that's how it was perceived at the time. I don't know Terry Pratchett's brain. But like, to see that as a very clear trans storyline in 2023, and that was not necessarily the intent back when it was written, is really cool. To be like, oh, this narrative is about like transness and all this sort of stuff, and lots of people see that trans narrative in Cherry, and like she is a beacon for trans fans of Terry Pratchett, and that's awesome, you know, and it's very cool. So it's like that sort of stuff. I think when you see people read more into it, is like, oh, yes, that's awesome. And I think it was a shame on Anne Rice's part. Again, I don't know her brain, I don't know her as a person, but I would say it was a shame that she wasn't able to see her fans' works and their ideas and their kind of adoration for her work as something to be praiseworthy and to be excited about, and to be like, oh, cool, what, you thought this? I never thought that. Wow. You've taken that out of,
Do you think that part of it is also, because of how early it was, also a misunderstanding of what fan fiction was?
I would say probably yes. I would imagine that there was a thing of how dare people write my characters without my permission. But fan fiction wouldn't have been that new. Like, as much as like the online fan fiction and stuff would have been new, and then maybe that's the difference, that actually like being aware of online fan fiction and forums.
Yeah, I was about to say, because it might have been that she wasn't aware of fan fiction. Yeah, because we've talked before about all sorts of different versions of fan fiction throughout the years already. But if you're not as aware of that, then it suddenly being more available to you and on your stuff as your entry point could be very disconcerting. And I think as somebody who is a professional writer, they probably also don't understand writing as a hobby that is not meant to be the end-all of your career, which I know a lot of people who write as a hobby without any intention of ever publishing because they don't care.
Yeah.
And it's probably hard to wrap your head around that if you're someone like Anne Rice or myself, who it's like, well, that's my intention is to make this my career, and therefore why not get things published? Yeah,
I suppose now, like, from my own experience, I am coming into a world as a writer, a non-fiction writer currently and a journalist, but also as somebody who is hoping to write fiction. But I'm coming into that with a deep knowledge of fan culture from being a fan myself, but just kind of existing, right? That this is something that's going to happen. And I think over the last even 5 years, people have gone from, oh my goodness, the fans, they write fan fiction, isn't that so funny? Let's make fun of them a bit. And I just had a wave of trauma. To literally, I was watching Taskmaster last night where they're like, people write fan fiction about us, isn't that amazing? You know, their reaction to it was, it's a bit funny and silly, but actually it was completely like, yeah, cool, that's hilarious, let's keep doing it. You know, there was no malice in it at all. It was a bit like, okay. And I think that's the reaction that a lot of people have now because people are aware of it. But even, I mean, I remember the way that the Sherlock fandom was treated around the time that show was big. And there was lots of stuff of like, there was that thing with Caitlin Moran where she read out fan fiction to Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman at a press conference, and it was so uncomfortable, and like nobody liked that, you know. But obviously, like, it was kind of meant to be funny, but it was just done in a way that was like, oh, you're just making everybody feel bad. You know, you're making the fans feel bad, you're making the people in the show feel bad for making fun of their fans, or at least being perceived to be making fun of their fans, even if that wasn't the intention, you know. It was it was kind of like, oh no. And that was only like, what, 5, 6, 7 years ago? Maybe a bit more than that. And so things have definitely changed. And I would say probably back in 2000, even though fan fiction, the fans knew that fan fiction existed and they were doing it and they were having a nice time doing it. I mean, fan fiction as a thing has existed since, what, the 70s, 80s? Probably, I'm going to go with probably it's the Star Trek thing. It's almost always a Star Trek thing, isn't it?
We could argue that it's been around for a long time, like we talked about
exactly.
fan fiction insert with the Bronte sisters.
Like the Bronte sisters. Yeah, exactly. I guess if we're using terminology, like, because if you're, like, the term fan fiction comes from fans writing fiction, and that initially was original fiction of science fiction written by people who were complicated.
It's all just definitions, which we've said before is all very dependent on how you want to define it, and if you change the definition slightly, then your timeline changes drastically.
Exactly. And like, what are we talking about? Yeah. So it's like, I do wonder whether you're right about that it was essentially a reaction to, I didn't know this thing existed, and now I do, and I don't like it, because these are my books and my characters, and I don't want people to do the wrong thing with them.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's half doing the wrong thing and half, well, these people are claiming ownership of this thing and not understanding that it's a way of engaging with the fiction in a fun, lighthearted way. That it's this idea of like, well, I wrote this character, and you're going, well, no, I wrote them. And that's the argument, rather than it being, I wrote these characters, and them going, yeah, we know.
Yeah. I think that it's also really interesting that the Vampire Chronicles fandom always called them specs, which is short for speculations. So they're very clearly saying, we are speculating what could happen with these characters. We're having a guess.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting that they were already calling it that. They weren't just calling it fanfic. They were calling it basically our version of ideas because we want to fill in the gaps. And that kind of is quite an unusual thing with fandoms in the first place, to be like, oh, we're just, particularly like this fandom, you literally have characters 100 years old. You can fill in some gaps, you know? So I just wonder whether maybe that's the other reason, is that, oh, you're speculating about the history of these characters and you're wrong because I know the entire history of these characters, and not sort of allowing the grace period of just the fans are just doing their own thing and you'll eventually tell them and they'll be right or wrong or whatever, you know?
Yeah, and they're not going to give a shit. I mean, they care, obviously, but, like, they don't care that their speculation was wrong.
Yeah. So there's a really interesting example of this that it's in the, I want to say Warhammer 40k. I'm going to be corrected by somebody. There's a guy who's been making loads of really interesting fan fiction and fan work, particularly videos about a certain character in 40k. And it's been doing really, like, it's been his baby. Like, he's really built up this thing. And then the law books came along and changed something and it just wiped out everything he'd done. It just can't have happened. And he's just like, I don't know what to do now. You know? Because he's obviously worked on this for years. And I'm like, oh, that's awful. Like, you kind of really feel for that. You're like, oh, you'd filled in all these gaps and all this sort of stuff, and they've just done one thing. And that's just removed everything you've worked on. But it also means, you know, the work is still there. The work is still valid and relevant, and people still love it. So I feel like hopefully he'll continue doing it. That would be cool. But, like, I can see how that's quite difficult to deal with.
I used to listen to a Star Wars based tabletop role-playing game. And it was started, like, I don't know, a long time ago. But in the podcast, the story was that they were the Rogue One people. They were the ones that stole the plans to the Death Star and were trying to get them back to the rebellion. And then halfway through them doing this story, Rogue One came out.
Yeah.
And they were like, well... So they kept, I mean, it was obviously like a funny tabletop role-playing game, but so in it they kept making jokes about how, God, I hope somebody else isn't doing this same exact thing right now. Like, but yeah, you could see like people kind of seeing, oh, this would be a fun gap to fill for our fan endeavor into Star Wars or to Warhammer or to Interview with the Vampire, and then somebody writes something and then you're like, oh.
Yeah. It happens all the time. I mean, the joy with things, particularly like Star Wars and Marvel, is they have so much expansive universe to play with. You can kind of do anything. And then if something else happens, you'd be like, it's Legends, though. It's alternate universe, though, you know?
Yeah.
Like, there is a huge backlog of Star Wars canon that is no longer considered canon because it's just the Legends, because Disney went, that's too complicated. And partially I agree with that. They took the good stuff and kept that. So, you know, not everyone's going to agree with that, though. Fair enough. But it's difficult when you as a fan you want to play in the playground. You know, you want to play in the sandpit, and then the person who made the sandpit comes along and just goes, no, I'm going to do this over here and all of everything. My castle's bigger than yours. You know. I think fan interactions with creators are. Because I would call this an interaction with a creator. I would call when you write, where any fan work you create is an interaction with the media and the creator in some way, right? Whether you include death of the author or not, you are still interacting with them because they did create the thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a right or a wrong about that. It's just what it is. So, like, I'm not going to yell at people for being like, hey, you're still writing Harry Potter fan fiction, you know. How dare you? If they want to write Harry Potter fan fiction, they can. I think I personally maybe have still got a few little issues about people doing like cosplay from Harry Potter and stuff, because seeing it in safe spaces, what I would consider my safe space, like conventions and stuff, is a little bit hard. But I'm getting over that.
Maybe if they had like a lanyard that they were wearing that was like, I support trans lives. along with it.
I think there's a lot people can do, and I think it's the difference between, have you made it yourself, have you bought the official stuff, have you bought a knockoff, all of those sorts of things come into it, and it's
more complicated when the person's still alive and making money out of it, as opposed to like we were saying,
I think
Lovecraft.
That's it. Yeah, I think J.K. Rowling is a kind of a thing that is a whole thing unto itself. That whole situation in Harry Potter, it's hard to compare it, but at the same time, like, if people do want to still engage with it in a way that they feel like they kind of, as a fan, they're like, oh yeah, I love this thing and I'm gonna go and make my little fan works. Go and do it. Go make yourselves happy. There is so little happy at the moment. But also in this situation where you are interacting with the creator, I went way off point, but you are doing that, right? I think that you're having a conversation and it going back and forth, that like a creator can come in and say, this is all the work I've done, I'm not going to do anymore. And people could then go, oh, cool, yeah, da, da. And then they might come back in and go, hey, I've made a little bit more though. And people will get really excited about that. But it may also mean that some of those fics and stuff they wrote or made, or their art or their cosplay or something, no longer kind of makes sense. Or it might be that you're working on a cosplay of a character that you love, and then the finale comes out and shit goes down, and then you have to cry hysterically while you're still making the cosplay for the convention you're going to at the weekend. It definitely didn't happen to me. I do think that the conversation that fans have with creators through their works is really interesting. That you are going, we love this thing and it means so much to us. It means so much to us that we will put our blood, sweat and tears literally into it in some cases, that you are, I think as a creator, isn't that like the best form of flattery?
Yeah, I was gonna say,
imitation, the best form of flattery,
As much as you were kind of saying that I'm sure it will happen for you, but like when you were saying that when you do publish in your fiction and you kind of know that this stuff will happen, it might not if people don't love it.
I hope people like it.
And I'm sure it will for you, but like I also have been dabbling in the fiction, and the whole time I'm like, people are gonna hate this. There's no way that this is anything. And so if I finally did put it out and people made cosplays for it, or had a Reddit thread where they had their theory ideas and someone wrote a fan fiction, I'd be like over the moon about it, because I'd be like, oh my god, you actually give a crap about a thing I wrote.
Yeah, the funniest thing is that, like, because I'm writing it at the moment, and it's doing the thing with doing the rounds with editors and stuff like that, and I'm starting to kind of annoy agents and all that jazz, which is quite fun in a terrifying sort of way. And again, we're recording this. Future me might have something different to say right now. I don't know, but I can see the things that like people are going to be like. I can see they're going to ship certain characters, and I can be like, oh yeah, like this relationship, people are going to latch onto this, and like, oh, I think people are going to be like, that's really problematic, and I'm going to be like, I don't care. It's not, they're fine. People are complicated. All that kind of stuff. And I'm kind of hoping to see things that I've never thought of as well. Like, if it does happen, if people do really like it, all that kind of stuff. We're talking about my own work. I feel very egotistical right now. It might never happen. But if it did, I would love to see what other people thought about it. I would love to be like, oh, wow, your brain. It's so different to my brain. That's excellent,
Yeah.
But it is that whole thing. I think in this situation, I feel like with fan fiction, people are... It is imitation to a certain extent, and that is the best form of flattery you can have when people they love your thing so much they want to do it themselves. And doesn't mean there isn't like going to be a human emotion involved in that at some level from both sides, but it's great. I also, like, I love, one of my favourite things about fan fiction, and I think this is probably where we'll end this conversation, is when people mimic the writing style of the writer in the fan fiction. And with some people it's really obvious, like if you've... I'm going to out myself right now. If you've ever read any Jeeves and Wooster fan fiction, it's absolutely genius because they just write extra stories for Bertie to do chaos. But they try and mimic the writing style. And sometimes people go a bit too over the top with it, and it's a little bit like too much, because obviously they're trying to get that very distinct feeling that P.G. Wodehouse has when he writes.
Yeah.
But when people hit the nail on the head, you're like, oh, there's more stories. That's somebody else. This is great. And obviously, like, Jeeves and Wooster is out of copyright and all that kind of stuff. So it's it's a different thing, and people can create more work for it. But That's so cool to be like, oh wow, you love this thing and you're gonna try and make it as close to the original as possible and make more of it. I think that's really fun. I think that's really, really fun. You can see it in, like, there's not much Hitchhikers fanfic out there, but I'm imagining that must be very stylized as well in the nature of Hitchhikers. And the same is true that, like, Pratchett fanfiction, often they use copious amounts of footnotes because, you know, that's his thing, right? Is footnotes. So these kind of stuff, I love those little things that fans pick up on within the thing they love, within the text they love, and they mimic it into their own works. I think it's very cool and very interesting. And I love fans doing fan things. It's great. Keep doing fan things, guys. Please do it. That's why I want to end the podcast, telling people to be positive.
Bye.
That's it. We're going. We're leaving now.
Do you think people have, like, fan fiction of the podcast eventually?
I hope so.
The thing is that there'll be one ship and it'll be, like, Egg and Tom and not anything to do with us.
Like, because we talk about them and then people are like, who are these people?
They're the mysterious extra characters.
The person who came and closed the door earlier because I was being too loud. I do actually have a way I wanted to end the podcast because a really exciting thing happened to me this week, which again, future Ollie will be like, oh my god, about, because future Ollie knows what's going on. But my book cover, I got sent my book cover this week.
Very exciting.
I'm so excited. Like, genuinely, it's pretty and I'm very happy with it. I'm really excited for this book to come out. And I'm definitely going to be that person who's like, hey, you should buy my book. But this will be out by the time the book's out, so maybe I should start plugging it.
Oh, really? Your book's come out that fast?
I think so. I think I could plug it.
I mean, you might as well. You can probably at least stalk the publisher site and get pre-orders or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you are interested in a book by me about fandom, where I talk about Anne Rice, I do talk as a whole chapter about Anne Rice. And lots of very exciting other things. I talk a lot about Star Trek, probably far too much, but it deserves its place. You know, they did a lot of work, a lot of heavy lifting, that fandom. But I also talk about, like, Byron and Dickens and fandom, and Vivian. I talk about Vivian, which is great.
I'm excited.
Well, there's a whole little conversation between us. It's cute. It's called A Exploration into Fans and Fandom, and it's coming from Pen and Sword Publishing. So you can go, Pen and Sword Books. You can search either, both is fine. And if it's out, get it. If you can pre-order it. It looks great. I'm really proud of it. I wouldn't plug it as much as I do if I wasn't super proud of it. And it's got lots of really cool pictures and also some cool interviews with some YouTubers and, like, some academics, because of course they're academics. This is an academic land podcast. And I really hope people like it. And they listen to this and they read the book, and my rambling hasn't made them be like, why would I read that?
I'm excited to read it. I'm looking forward to it.
Yay! And then they'd be like, Ollie, why is it so... What have you done? I think we should finish here, and we should say a big bye-bye to everybody, because my brain has literally fallen out of my head. I should have gone to a 5-day-long Star Wars convention at the beginning of this week. That was... I no longer have the stamina for it. Oh my god, please end the podcast.
Well, go buy or pre-order Holly's book, please. Pre-orders actually do make a huge difference, so if it's not out yet, you can pre-order, please do so. And we'll talk to you next time.
Yeah.
Bye!
Goodbye, guys. Bye! Thanks for listening. Remember to like, review and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast, and do give it a share. Tell your friends, family and fellow fans and get the word out. You can follow us on social media, links in the show notes, as are some links to further reading. Who doesn't like a reading list? We are nerds after all. Music for this episode was Nowhere Land by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons Attribute 3.0. This episode was produced by Vivian, Asimos and Holly Swinyard. Should I attempt to see if I can talk with these in? Apparently not. I'll just swallow them. How can I be a vampire without fangs? Oh, okay, no, got it. I got it. Okay. I literally can't talk with them in, though. That's so funny. I don't think I could even, like, start the podcast with them in. I don't even remember what I bought them for now. I'm assuming a Halloween costume, because I've never cosplayed a character who has fangs. Like, never.